now 115 people dead in what appears to be a terror attack in Russia, in Moscow, and Islamic State has claimed responsibility, although we don't know what bit of Islamic State it is. The death toll now at 115. Also, many people left fighting for their lives when gunmen in camouflage clothing opened fire with automatic weapons. This was people at the Crocus City Hall yesterday. 3 men named by authorities believed to be the killers are feared to be on the run. In regard to that, there are people seeing a Soviet-era rock group called Picnic. They were about to perform at 8 o'clock when this horrendous massacre began. Jonathon, this is just absolutely dreadful in terms of what has happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's, all terrorist attacks are horrendous, and this seems to have been an extremely serious one with many, many casualties and perhaps more sadly to come. I just saw a news alert that the Russian authorities have arrested some suspects on their way to the border. They were trying to flee. As with everything in Russia, one does have to take what the Russian authorities say with a significant grain of salt. Obviously, the fact that there's been an attack is obviously not in dispute. Yeah. But we know that the Russians do not necessarily have a good track record when it comes to sort of attributing blame for attacks.
Although ISIS have actually, they've claimed responsibility for this.
But they also have claimed responsibility for things they haven't had anything to do with in the past.
That's also true.
And we know, there is strong evidence that in the terrorist attacks that happened in Moscow, do you remember when the apartment blocks were blown up? I think it was in sort of 1999 or maybe just after that, and which precipitated a major offensive in Chechnya at the time. There was some evidence and allegations that was a false flag in order to provide that pretext. So one always has to be careful with these things.
And also with the proximity of the Russian elections, there are so many elements of this. We're actually going to talk to Mary Dejevsky about this hopefully tomorrow if Mary's available. Obviously we're dominated by the Princess Kate stuff today, but this is a big story in Russia and we're not going to ignore it. We're not ignoring it today, but we're going to talk about it in more depth hopefully on the show tomorrow. I'm on between 10 and 1, as you may know. In a statement released on Telegram last night, this is the messaging app Telegram, the extremist group said IS fighters attacked a large gathering on the outskirts of the Russian capital Moscow before they had, as they put it, retreated to their bases safely. But as Jonathon says, there do seem to be some arrests here. Connor, what do you make of this?
Well, the Russians have been battling ISIS in Syria for a long time. I don't think it would be the same central IS as the UK and US forces fought before, because, as we know, the Trump administration took a large amount of their territory and resources away from them from sustained bombing campaigns. But it's not impossible this is a splinter group. But as you already said, Jonathon, I mean, especially after the Russian election, you cannot know whether or not this is a false flag, because, as George Frost Kennan said in the 50s, he was Kennedy's ambassador to Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, which Putin often blames for mismanaging Russia, but also idolizes for winning the Second World War. They often demonized the outside West and said we are under constant attack, therefore we must shore up our state surveillance, we must ensure that we have autocratic power, we must manage the economy, because there is always an existential threat beyond the borders that could attack from within. So it is a very useful, and I'm not saying it's good, obviously, very useful thing for Putin to then turn around and say, because this is happening, we must have more security powers.
We'll see what the reaction to that is.
I guess one thing that would sort of militate against the kind of any false flag argument, and I'm not suggesting this is a false flag. I'm just saying that there are allegations that the Russians have been responsible for false flag attacks in the past.
Yes.
But the one thing that would militate against that is the fact that the US did put out quite an unusual public statement, because you normally think that will go through sort of private intelligence channels about an explicit threat to large gatherings in Russia. I think that was just 2 weeks ago, in the next couple of weeks. And so with that in mind, I suppose if you were in Russia, did ordinary people necessarily know that? Because we know that the Russians have blocked sort of social media channels, that sort of ordinary Russians have great difficulty in accessing non-Kremlin sanctioned news sources.
We often know a lot more about it. Hold fire for a second, because I want to put a point to you, Connor. What Leo has WhatsApped in. Morning, Peter, hope you're well. Regarding the terrorist attacks in Moscow, how much do we know about the threat that the Islamist extremism poses to Russia in comparison to the West? And is it even possible to to divorce it from what's happening in Ukraine. Interesting point. What do you make of that?
I'll firstly say about the threat of potential Islamic extremism. Putin has been arming various Islamic militants to act as supplementary forces during the Ukrainian war. So he has allied with Muslims in Chechnya and the like. There is actually a large problem with Islamic extremism in that region. That's why you get so many UFC fighters, because often they go down there to do something productive rather than UFC fighters. So like oh blooming hell, one of the Khabib brothers, right? Some of the main champions are because they're so dedicated to that rather than going down the path of Islamic extremism. They want to give the men something productive. So it's not impossible. But picking up on that, there was a piece in the New York Times a couple of days before this happened, essentially predicting that there could be a large-scale terror attack. So whether or not the Ukrainians or the American State Department were involved in something like this, this will be certainly something that Putin can point to and say, well, how did they know this was happening? Were the Americans involved in launching an attack on Russian soil? We're essentially at war against the West, therefore we need to double down on the war effort.
Okay.